My parents were Polish Jews who had actually lived in France most of their adult life. And when Hitler invaded Poland, my father was very aware of what was going on, and he thought that Belgium would stay neutral. So they moved into Belgium in 1939, and I was born February 1940 in Belgium, and Germany invaded May the 10th and went down through the Netherlands, Belgium and France. And because my parents were Polish, they started rounding up the foreign men first. The native-born Jews were not being affected. So my father was taken pretty early on, and he was actually held in a prison for probably about 6 months because the army were busy, you know. Anyway, he was deported on an ordinary passenger train towards the east, as they were told, to go to a labour camp. And probably the autumn of 1940. And whereas the others in his group sort of felt they had to do what they were told, yeah. My father, being the kind of man he was, he actually went to the back of the train and he jumped off. Now, we had remained in Belgium. My father had cousins who were looking after us. They were Belgian nationality. And at that time, women and children weren't being rounded up. It's a complicated story. My father finally made his way back to Paris. He hid with a cousin of his, who was French, who actually didn't want him, but agreed to hide him. And my father let my mother know. We went to Paris sometime at the beginning of 1941, and we were staying with my mother's married sister because it wasn't safe for us to be together because the men were in danger. My father nearly got rounded up in the summer of 1941. The porter actually covered for him and hid him, and he was smuggled down into Vichy, where he was able to register, and he was working on a farm. Again, still didn't seem that women and children would be rounded up. And Vichy at that time, the Germans would say to the Vichy authorities, right, we want 10,000 men this week. But there were so many foreign Jews in the occupied that that was okay. So they weren't rounding up anyone in the unoccupied. 1942 July, my mother went to register with the two of us, and a policeman warned her that we were to be rounded up. And this roundup has been written up and whatnot. We were smuggled up down into Vichy, and for a little while my parents were together, and then they started rounding up the men, even in the unoccupied, the foreign men again. And my father was in an internment camp somewhere near Lake Annecy, somewhere around there. And he managed to escape, and he climbed into Spain, and he sent the guy back for us, but we didn't turn up. The Quakers were acting as the relief organization in Spain, and they said to my father, as he was a Pole, if he could get to the British embassy, he might be able to join the forces through there. He went to the British embassy and they wanted some papers. He didn't have anything. He went to the Polish embassy not expecting anything, and he just, absolute serendipity. The official there was from his town and knew his brother, so he gave my father papers. My father thought we had gone because Vichy had fallen and that they started deporting everyone. What, French, Polish, didn't matter, women, children, So my father got to England May 1943 as part of the British Army, which was how he was allowed to stay. The guide had come back, but because of the conditions and everything, we didn't climb over until sometime Bishy fell. All I know is it was very cold and whatnot. And we were captured on the border, but it was by the Spanish, and they let us in. My sister was put in an orphanage, and my mother and I were put in prison. But my mother said the local Spanish police and the local people were very kind to the refugees, and we were allowed out, and they brought us toys and food and everything. And the Quakers came and said the Americans had finally sent a convoy for the children that were trapped in France, but all the children had already been deported, and they would take children 15 and under, but they wouldn't take the adult. Anyway, they expected Spain to fall, so my mother said we could go, and we went to America, and I was fostered by a family. We were separated, and it was not until 1947 that I was reunited with parents that I didn't know. Well, when I was reunited with my parents in 1947, I had been in the United States for over 3 years, and it was at the time of a child's life when you change who you are. Because when I went to America in 1943, I spoke French. I had my original name was Fanny Zimmerbaum, and when I got to America, I was in an orphanage and I was picked up by a family. And the whole ethos at that time was forget the past, move on. So my name was changed, my language was changed, and I forgot my past. And I had a new family, and I thought I was part of that family. So when one day I came home from school and I was told I didn't actually belong to that family and that my parents had been in the war, no one used the word Holocaust or anything like that. It was the war, and that they had survived and they were living in England. I thought it was a mistake, and I told my American father not to be upset. He said I was going to go to England, where my parents were living. Of course, when I got off the plane at Croydon Airport in those days, and there were these two absolute demented people, because obviously for my mother, all she wanted was to have her children back. And they grabbed me, and I didn't owe them, and I didn't want to have anything to do with them. And my mother didn't even speak English, and I didn't speak. I'd lost my French completely. And my parents were Polish, so they spoke to each other in Polish. These people were completely impoverished, they were completely broken. Everything in their world was gone. My mother was one of 7 adults who all had children and grandchildren and cousins, completely gone. So, they just weren't anything to do with the people, the culture I'd been brought up with. My father, I honestly can't say when, but he would started talking about things. It would have been later on, actually. In the beginning, it was like, you're here, and we're getting on with life. Right. And my father would say things. I actually went backwards and forwards between my 2 families for the next 10 years. And the Holocaust wasn't spoken about. No one spoke about the Holocaust. And he would talk about, they were deporting him and he jumped off the train, and my mother carried us over the Pyrenees. And it not only didn't mean anything to me, I just thought, this is all fantasy. What made my mother not give up is my father, although they weren't together, he was very much the dominant personality in that. And eventually he escaped the second camp in France climbed over into Spain and sent the guide back for us. And I mean, I wasn't there, well, I was there, but you know.
You don't remember.
But knowing their personalities, if the guide said to my mother, your husband has sent me and we've got to climb over the mountains, she wouldn't have questioned it, she would have just done it. And even when I was told about it, you know, I went, about 4 or 5 years, I went to a commemoration ceremony at the bottom of the Pyrenees, and it was in July. And you looked up and there was still snow and ice everywhere. And it's only then that you think, how did this tiny woman, and she was tiny, she was under 5 foot, and God knows what she was like then, you know, emaciated. Now, I know they waited for people, and I think a lot of airmen were being smuggled back in, and I think we were with a group of airmen, because my mother would say something like, oh, you know, you were crying, and the guide said, if she can't stop us crying, she has to suffocate us, because it was cold, you know, and you're crying and you're endangering the whole group. It was not until my American father died, when I was already in my mid-40s and I had grown up children, and I went to his funeral, and it was such a secret that when I went to his funeral and went home, and the American aunts and cousins were there, my American mother grabbed hold of me and whispered in my ear, don't tell anyone you're adopted. I mean, that was the whole thing, you know. And my cousin started asking, you know, gee, Joni, how come you live in England and whatnot? And I thought, because up until then I'd gone backwards and forwards between my two families, and it was like I had to be two different people. And it was then I thought to myself, I've got to find out who I am. I mustn't be ashamed of who I was, you know. And I actually started looking in archives. I came back to England, and, you know, I started trying to find it. And I knew I'd gone to America, so I started looking in the newspapers, and I found a little article in one paper about a group of children who'd gone to America from Portugal in 1943. And it mentioned the organizations in America, and I wrote to them. And the initial response was more or less, you know, don't worry your pretty little head about this, you know. The archives are really only for academics. That was very much the attitude. Anyway, I finally did. I came to America, went into the archives of the Joint and the Quakers, and began to see the social workers' reports. And I realized they knew a lot more. They knew I had a mother. And it confirmed that I spoke French. And, you know, and that's when I started looking into it. And that's when I actually sat down with my father and more or less interviewed him.
How essential do you think it is to talk about such things and, you know, kind of just recollect the memories and, you know, just have an audience? Yes, I do feel, I mean, one of the reasons I speak is you want people to see you as a human being, not as a stereotype. And you want them to understand just what prejudice can do and where it can lead to. And on the other side of the coin there is so much denial and stuff, and people will believe what they want to believe, you know. So we should end on that
Yeah.
note.
Thank you very
so
much.
Okay.